Well, greetings, everyone, from Muhammad on a beautiful Sunday afternoon. It's sunny, and we're going to get outside and take the dog on an adventure in a little while. But first, I wanted to get this lesson ready for you tomorrow. This is certainly a lesson that I would very much have liked to have done in person. Um, I'm a little concerned that, me just sitting here talking to you is just going to sound like indoctrination, and I don't mean it to be that way. Um, it would be easier to do in class where you would have a chance to exchange with me. So, particularly for this lesson, you might want to jot down some things as we're going through it that you would like to question me about or ask me about, comments that you would like to make, and post them to the video so that I can respond to them. Sorry, this is how we have to do this one, but it's I've already pushed it back a week, hoping we'd be back, but it's not going to happen. So here we go. So I'm going to pray for this one at the beginning. Lord, I just pray that you would just bless this time, that you would give me wisdom, that you would help students to hear my heart and to hear your truth and not just what my opinion is. Pray for your blessing and anointing on this time in Jesus' name. Amen. So if you haven't looked at the instructions on RenWeb for Monday morning, you need to have your notes with you. So at the very end of the 60s Fragmenting of American Culture, the last page of notes, how did contemporary attitudes regarding sexuality and identity develop? It's been a very long journey. You're going to need those. So if you don't have them, you should pause and run and get them and then come right on back, because I want you to be able to follow along with me as I talk about some things. So to a certain extent, I know this is going to sound weird, but our whole school year has brought us to this day and to this lesson. Probably the most defining aspect of worldview in our culture today is around the ways in which popular culture, media, but way farther back than just these things we've been talking about, have come to define and shape our attitudes towards sexual identity and sexual relationships and sexual intimacy and all these things that we're going to talk about today. It's been a really, really long journey since the very beginning of class. I think maybe second day or so when we were talking about creation. So just to start at the beginning here, some basic things. The Judeo-Christian worldview, if that's what you want to call it, a biblical worldview, the gospel of truth, whatever you want to call it, sets things out from the outset. God, in his word, gave his creation identities as male and female and specific boundaries for sexual expression. So we see these in Genesis 1 and 2. In Genesis 1, God created man in his image. Male and female, he created them. So, there's not much more you can say about that. Genesis chapter 2, after the discussion of the creation of Eve, man leaves his father and mother and bonds to his wife. I think that is an important word. And the two become one flesh. So the Bible's clear in pointing out to us that sexual intimacy is something designed by God, and it comes with the opportunity for tremendous blessing in that Hebrew idea of becoming one flesh, of bonding with someone in a way that you become one person. You're no longer two separate people. But it also has the opportunity to take us into terrible bondage. The marriage bed is this euphemism in older translations of Scripture. Hebrews 13:4. Let the marriage bed be held in honor among all, and let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled. So this bonding is a great blessing, and it's the ultimate expression of love between two human beings. God designed it to be that way. But also, Lots of scriptures speak, and I'm not going to go down the road with all these scriptures. There are lots of scriptures that talk about the bondage that can come, grave bondage, as opposed to bonding, by giving ourselves over to any kind of sexual experience and arousal outside of that marriage bed. This takes us down a road of ultimate lust. There really is no such thing, despite of what the 60s tried to tell us, as casual sex. All sexual intimacy costs us something, and I'll come back to that a little bit more later. So now kind of jumping over the classical thing, the church, of course, throughout the history of the church until modern times, affirmed God's created order, and it upholds these boundaries that were established in Genesis by making marriage a sacred thing. Now we think of marriage today as almost like this civil contract. That's why for a while a lot of states were passing laws allowing homosexual couples to marry, in quotation marks, but they called them civil unions because you're doing it in front of civil authorities. But for most of the history, for most of Christian history, marriage was regarded as a sacred thing. In Lutheran and Catholic and Episcopal churches, it is a sacrament. It's something that you do before God, and the Holy Spirit is doing something in that marriage. When we started turning marriage into a more civic expression because of the pluralism in our culture, which we've talked about in the past, that changes a lot of attitudes about marriage. So now back to the classical worldview. This is kind of the way we began the year. Remember, the pre-modern worldview is rooted in biblical and classical roots. So, you always hear these things about, oh, those Greeks and Romans, man, they did it with those young boys all the time. And that's probably one of the greatest myths of the classical world. I'm not going to go too deeply into that, but certainly we've learned that even though that did happen and continues to happen today and throughout all of history, it was never seen as anything other than a sexual indulgence. It was an enslavement to one's appetites. And all the classical writers would always talk about sexual restraint as being a virtue. Remember Plato's 3 body parts? We don't want to be directed by our appetites, by our lower regions, by the baser part of who we are. We want to exercise our will over that, and then we want to have wisdom to guide our will in the control of our appetites. All throughout history, societies put together cultural interdicts. Remember, things where you speak into the culture and you say, these are some boundaries that we agree upon, and those boundaries are always built around sexual things. A forbidding of incest, a valuing of a marital commitment. These are based on a moral consensus that for, again, most of the history in the West in particular were built on Scripture. They were built on the authority of the church, and then put into law by the civil authorities, because the civil authorities respected this basis of the moral law. So not only was transgressing sexual transgressions like adultery, like fornication, like lust, and where does that word fornication come from anyway? What is that? That's it's an Englishing of a Greek word that's going to sound sort of familiar, porneia. Porneia is a word that describes any kind of sexual activity or even self-gratification outside of the boundaries of marriage. So that gets Englished into fornication, but we also still, of course, have the word porn in our lexicon too. So sexual transgressions were seen as sinful, and then there were laws. And I know there's a lot of disagreement about that. Should the civil authorities be passing laws that, for most of the history of the West, it was really hard to get a divorce because it was seen as a violation of a vow that you made before God. The adultery was against the law. Sodomy, which was always, kind of a, I don't know if it's a euphemism, but it's a way of describing intercourse between people of the same sex. These were outlawed by law until very recently, until the 1960s, is when those laws all started to become undone. And we know why. Because one of the characteristics of modernity is that it elevates what the individual wants and desires over the cultural interdicts. And those cultural interdicts, century after century since the Enlightenment, start losing their power. So remember, in the Enlightenment, Descartes' famous cogito. So this is a different way of looking at reason. What I think is elevated over the universal truth of the logos. We talked about that when we were talking about Descartes. Romanticism, when that comes along, that elevates eros, what I feel, over agape, a universal sense of charity, of love for my fellow man. And then we come to the two biggies here, Mr. Freud, who we've spent an awful lot of time with. Freud basically gives us the cultural permission to be more sexually open-minded, and in some cases that was a good thing, but in a lot of cases it wound up just allowing us to indulge ourselves. And then along came Mr. Kinsey, who you just read about, Kinsey's reports on sexual behavior of the American male and the American female. So, in that Kinsey article, we see some things that give us a sense of the illusion that, everybody's doing it, everybody's indulging themselves, so why should I? In fact, that little clipboard, the graphic on the Kinsey article that has the two Latin words on it, fac id, that means essentially all do it. If everybody's doing it, then it must be okay, right? Well, that's not true. It's the classic if everybody's jumping off a cliff sort of a thing. Probably should say a couple of things about Kinsey before we move on. You got most of what you needed from the article, I think. You see that his research was controversial because it was questionable. How much stock do you want to put in especially in 1948 and 1953, and people who are openly willing to talk about their sex lives and experiences? He was abusive to his staff and to his wife during the course of his research, wanting to try all kinds of experimental things with his staff, asking his wife to do it too, sadomasochism, just terrible things. This man's doing all this in the name of research. And he's basically, supporting his research with the data that he wants to pick and choose that makes it look like everybody's doing it. The big question, I think, in the end, toward the end of the article, the big question has to be put: what is life? Is it nothing in particular? If it's for nothing in particular, and good for the Keynesian, because it suggests an ample scope for self-expression. If, on the other hand, as Christians have always asserted, the purpose of life is to love and serve God, a wholly new set of obligations emerge. Self shrinks back out of the spotlight, unable to have it on the self's own way. It must be someone else's way, a someone with a powerful claim on us. And then this is a little bit later, and you don't have this in your article. He says, this sex business, this Kinsey business, it all may come down in the end to the question of how much stock do you put in the creed. Specifically, how much stock do you put in those introductory words that we all say when we say this is what it means to be a Christian. I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in all things visible and invisible. Just because things aren't visible doesn't mean that they aren't real. Kinsey devoted himself to a different creed, one of self-expression, lived without the slightest hint of shame. Under that creed, he focused on what people do or say they do, as opposed to what they should do. Indeed, as he saw it, should was a word that should mostly be kept out of sight in the modern age. Okay, back to our how did we get here little journey. So postmodernity, which we've been stepping into but haven't really been calling it that yet. There's going to be more to come on this, and we're going to learn how uh, postmodern isn't an age; it's a shift. It's a thing. It's really a wearing out of people's defenses, a fatigue, a growing tired of trying to figure things out and just letting things be. Let's just let it be. We're tired of trying to figure out if there's a right way to live or a way that I should live. So, popular culture takes sexuality and mediates it and commodifies it, and that's something that is worth taking a minute to think about. You know, Kinsey, in that Kinsey article, it said Kinsey's reports helped persuade Americans to regard sex as just the common currency of life, in whatever form it might come, wherever, whenever, with whomever, with whatever. And so that kind of leads into the whole pop culture 60s and 70s sexual revolution, this idea now that sexual intimacy becomes recreational. It's just something that we do. A lot of times we do it as what we think is an expression of love, but a lot of times it's just a recreational experience. The 60s and 70s taught us to demand our sexual rights and reject any sexual restraints. Uh, it the lie in this is that sexual intimacy is a personal matter. The freedom to use my body as I please should be an unfettered choice. I alone will decide what I do with my body. Well, the truth of that is, from a biblical perspective, it's not your body. Your body belongs to God, your creator. We're called to present ourselves to Him as an act of worship, even in our sexuality. Probably, especially in our sexuality, if you look at 1 Corinthians 6, verses 12 through 20, give that a read. You know, the attitudes we adopt towards sexuality are an ultimate form of our worship for God. That's why it makes it such a critical issue for us to wrestle with as thoughtful Christians. So once we get to this point, and this is where we've been for some time, we define sexuality to suit ourselves in whatever way we want to. So now, before I move on to the discussion of homosexuality and what a Christian attitude I think should be, let me point out three important things. Okay, first, God created everyone to love and to desire to be loved. But now, who is the determiner of who is lovable? That makes a big difference in the way that we approach sexual intimacy now. Who is deemed to be lovable is largely defined now by popular culture and the media, which leaves an awful lot of people out because we're all not pretty people, are we? We're all not sexy people. But when we see that as the item to be desired in pornography, oh my goodness, it's just like, this is the struggle. This is the struggle with pornography, is it gives us a false sense of what our desire should be directed to. I'll come back to that in a little bit. Okay, second thing, God created us, this is a reminder, God created us male and female. Okay, that's not just biblical, that's biological. And you can certainly point out, hermaphrodites and people who are born with, and all that kind of stuff. But that is not the norm of the human experience. The norm of the human identity is we are males or we are females. But now that reality is being defined by my personal choice. I get to decide, regardless of my biological realities, what I desire to be. Third thing is God created us to desire sexual intimacy. It's not some aberration of who we are. Now, it's not the defining characteristic of who we are, like Freud would say. This desire is not what defines us. It's an aspect of our humanity. Now, when we indulge our sexual appetites, that's when our sexual appetites and our desires start to define us. I'm going to take a little aside here before we move on and give you Mr. Williams' 2 rules to understand about sexual intimacy. Now, if we were in class, I'd tell you more stories about why I know these things and my own personal history, but I don't think I want to go on camera with all that kind of stuff. I'm sorry we don't have the opportunity for me to be a little bit more transparent and real with you. But here's my 2 rules from personal experience. Doesn't matter who you are, believer, non-believer, this is the way it is. If you have the opportunity to indulge in sexual intimacy, and by that I mean you've just got somebody else who is willing and you've got a place to engage in sexual intimacy, you will take advantage of it, especially if this is somebody that you really care about. So this is why it's really important. I know this is kind of, you probably think this is really old-fashioned, but if you're in a relationship with somebody who you really care about, and you know the desires that are already rising up inside of you, you know the passions, you know what that feels like. And even if you're not in a relationship, God designed you to desire that. That's a part of the human identity, is to desire to love and to be to be the object of someone's love and to desire to love somebody else. If you are in a relationship like that and you don't minimize or completely eliminate the opportunity to be intimate. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, this gets me to my second rule. Whatever sexual intimacy you experience, the next time you have the opportunity, you will want more. So, my wife and I talk about how much we still remember the first time, is I think our first date, the first time I reached out and took her hand and we held hands. And that was an expression of intimacy. Maybe not sexual yet, but just that grasping of the hand makes me want to draw an arm around her and pull her close. That drawing an arm around her to pull her close makes me desire to hug, to kiss, to touch, and it's progressive. The sexual desire that fuels the desire for intimacy is a progressive thing. So whatever you experience, the next time you have the opportunity, you will want more. And then that takes you back to rule number 1. If you have the opportunity, you will take it. So the only way in my thinking, and I was not very good at navigating this, I'll just be honest with you, as a young divorced Christian in a singles group, I wasn't very good at and of course I hadn't formulated these 2 rules back then, but I look back now and I know them to be true. So the thing is we think about this being true in terms of lust, but I tell you where most of you will struggle with this the most is when you have somebody that you really care about. You struggle with these 2 rules apply to you whether or not it's lust or it's genuine love. The same thing will happen. You've got to go back to those biblical principles of God's boundaries and design for the expression of sexual intimacy in marriage. Okay, so now moving on to the controversial issue of the age. Let's take a look at that little article, why homosexuality is not like other sins. And I'm just going to walk through some of these things. He starts off with, and this to me is one of the best expressions of a proper biblical way to approach this issue, I think. And we dearly need to have a proper biblical way of approaching this. So he starts off with 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 10, which you can read. This is a list of classic things that separate us from God. Certainly homosexuality is not the only sin mentioned in that list. So let's be real about sin. Sin is sin. And none of these things deserve any more punishment or any less condemnation than anything else. So before we focus in on the word homosexuality, let's make sure that we're being honest about all these other sins that are a part of our lives. That's an important thing. But now he goes on to say it's a different thing, especially in the cultural moment that we live in now. Because most of these things, each of these unrepentant sins are the same in the sense of God's judgment, but the thing that's making that's different now is none of these sins are applauded so aggressively by a whole group of people who advocate for their normalcy. You don't see anybody advocating for making drunkenness or idolatry or thievery or swindlers or anything like that. We're not going to try to pretend like those are normal things. And there's still laws against a lot of those kinds of things. So that's an important thing to remember. Down at the bottom of the page, he says, it's an oversimplification to say that Christians or conservative evangelicals are simply against homosexuality. This is a posture that we need to adopt, to go back to Crouch's language. We are against sin, and that's what makes it so hard to deal with this issue in a culture that says love is love. Yes, God created everybody to love and to desire to be loved. That is true. Love is love, but sin is also sin. And if you're going to adopt a biblical, compassionate stance on this, you have to stand on the truth that sin is sin. We are against any sin that restrains people from everlasting joy in God. That's the key. Any kind of sin we are against. And then he gives these two different points of view. You got the left and the right. You've got the people who praise homosexuality and say we should embrace it. And then we've got the bigoted people on the right who hate homosexuality. So we've got the lovers and the haters, so to speak. If you don't hate, you support. If you don't support, you hate. These are the two polar opposites that we need to kind of get away from. And then here's the key sentence. It is clear in God's revealed word that homosexual acts are sinful. We don't hate those who embrace homosexuality. We love them enough not to collapse under the societal pressure to say it's not sin. We speak truth in love, saying that's wrong, but also still saying I love you. We're not the left. We say this is wrong. And we're not the right. We say you are loved. You're wrong and you're loved. This all comes back to God's grace. Now, what are we going to do with the reality here of same-sex attraction? I don't deny, and no thoughtful Christian should deny the reality of same-sex attraction. That takes us back to the progression that I walked you through. You have to understand that this is not something that just came out of nowhere. Same-sex attraction is a reality for some people. It is an appetite. It's no different than any other appetites that I would have, but for the good of myself and for the good of my condition before God and for the good of my society, I can't indulge in all the sexual appetites that come my way. I just can't go walking down the street, grabbing girls and doing whatever I want to with them because I desire them. And you know what? I especially, boy, when it's summertime and you're at a beach, I don't go to the beach very often probably because of this. When you see girls in bikinis, when you see media depictions, I'm still a guy. I know I'm an old guy, but I'm still a guy. Those appetites are there in me. I don't indulge them. I can't indulge them because I know what will happen. The more I indulge, the more I will want, the more it will damage my life, the less I will cultivate a virtuous life. So no different than I have to deal with my own sexual desires that turn into that follow after appetites. People who have genuine same-sex attraction, and that can come from all kinds of things. I don't want to get into the psychology of this, and there's a lot of you have probably read more about this than even I have, because this is an issue that you're wrestling with family members, with people that you know and love, and that's what makes it really, really hard to still say that it's sin. But you say that it's sin, you say that it's love, that you're loved. Now, this one's going to be a little... So this progression brings us to the point. Look at how I worded these things. This word choice is careful. By the time we get down to Freud gives us permission to be more sexually open-minded. Kinsey gave us an excuse to be more sexually self-indulgent. Pop culture mediates. They throw sexuality at us all the time. They commodify sexuality. Pop culture and media also defines what it means to be sexually desirable. Who should we desire? The 60s and 70s gave us a cultural revolution. I should also point out in the 60s also came along the birth control pill. My wife and I talked about that the other day a little bit. The power to demand our sexual rights, to reject any sexual restraints. That's how we get here today, to where this is being offered as normal. Now here's a level of compassion to exercise. This is just me. This is just something that I've thought of and kicked around, and I could be way off base here. But this takes us all the way back to where this whole discussion began. God created everybody to love and to desire to be loved. That's a natural part of who we are. When sexual intimacy was more safely in the boundaries of marriage culturally. Now, there's always been fornication. There's always been all kinds of sexual aberrations, but they've never been normative. They've never been socially acceptable. They've always been on the fringe of civilized society. When sexual intimacy was seen as something that was a sacred part of a commitment to one another, there wasn't so much concern about, are you beautiful? Are you sexy? Are you desirable in the way that's being portrayed? And I think that popular culture and media contributes to this by elevating these images so much that those of us who aren't so pretty, those of us who aren't so sexy, so whatever, we feel left out of the fun. We're living in a culture that says everybody's doing it. Why aren't you doing it? Well, maybe I'm not doing it because nobody seems to want me. And then I discover that I'm wanted by somebody the same sex as me. Maybe I've had some kind of traumatic experience when I'm young that has awakened sexual desires in a same-sex way that should never have been awakened, and now I'm carrying that baggage with me. And I find that girls don't think I'm very lovely, but I can find guys who do, because we both desire sexual intimacy. Guys don't find me so lovely. They don't find me too sexy. But I found some girls that do. That could be a reach. That's a Mr. Williams postulation, whatever the word is. I think that there's something to be said for that too. When we live in a culture that gives us permission and says the fulfilling my desire is what really matters, that's what brings us to the point where we're at. What is life for? If for nothing in particular, just pleasure, then self-expression without hindrance of shame is the great achievement of modernity. There is no should. There is only do. But if the purpose of life is to love and serve God, then a whole new set of obligations emerge. And that's something that we have to hang on to if we want to engage in the whole gamut of sexual intimacy as a part of our lives as thoughtful Christians. So, leave me some comments, ask me some questions. Don't be afraid to throw things out there. Don't be afraid to challenge me. I'm okay with that. I feel firm in my faith that I've just spoken the truth. But I also know that a good number of you live in a world where what I've just said sounds mean. And I apologize for that. Love you guys. I don't know. This coming week is going to be a little bit more leisurely, I think. You've got a 2-day lesson coming up after you do this one on Monday. We'll have a test on Thursday. I'll come back probably on Wednesday and talk a little bit more about that. See you later.